This is Lamar Waldron. Today would have been the 102nd birthday of President John Kennedy, so we're going to talk about his life and the tragic consequences of his death and how Attorney General William Barr has played a role in keeping thousands, maybe even millions of records about JFK's murder from Congress and the American public. Lamar is my old friend and collaborator. We worked together on 2 books about JFK's assassination, Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy. Lamar's latest book, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. Lamar, welcome back.
Great to be with you again, Tom.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Lamar. So, tell me about, well, actually, to start out, let's first talk about who killed JFK and why.
Great. That'll help lay the ground for the Barr material to come. And again, today would have been JFK's 102nd birthday, but it is important to stress, as you and I discovered in our many decades of research, that JFK's death was not some abstract thing that just happened to him. It was a direct result of his life, particularly his pursuit of organized crime that he began even before he became president, back when he was a senator, and his brother Robert Kennedy was the counsel of a Senate committee that looked into the ties between Jimmy Hoffa and organized crime, and then it dug deeply into organized crime, going after top godfathers, causing one of them to run down to Cuba to hide out there. And Kennedy was elected on a pledge to go after organized crime, go after their ally, Jimmy Hoffa. And when he became president, he appointed his brother, Robert Kennedy, to do just exactly that. And this was a campaign promise fulfilled. And when you see the charts, it's just ridiculous how the graphs just go off the charts practically, with how much more effort, time in grand juries, prosecutions. They ramped up the organized crime division of the Justice Department. They had their Get Hoffa squad, and they really, really went after organized crime. 2 godfathers in particular, the godfather of Louisiana and most of Texas, Carlos Marcello, and the godfather of much of Florida, Santo Trafficante. And these were not your typical godfathers like you would see on The Sopranos or in the Godfather movie, because they didn't battle with other mafia godfathers. They partnered with them. Trafficante, in particular, he continued his father's creation of the French Connection heroin network that brought the heroin over.
That movie was actually about a real situation that Trafficante was running. This was a real heroin import from France thing.
Oh, right. It's smuggling the heroin into cars, and not just in a general sense, but in fact, one of the people who got his cars in successfully, unlike the declining movie star in the movie whose car got caught with the heroin, Trafficante's main guy for that, Michael Victor Mertz, whose apartment building he went to while Mertz was still alive.
Yeah, I visited it in Paris.
Right. And it was in a great neighborhood where the Duke of Windsor, used to live. Because when you help a godfather assassinate the President of the United States, you do quite well. And so that godfather in particular, he was deported from Dallas the day after the assassination. So, but the bottom line is, it was these 2 godfathers, and they used the godfather of Chicago was an older guy who delegated much running of the Chicago mafia to a guy who was a mob boss, not a godfather, named Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana was under so much pressure from the Kennedys. He delegated his role in the assassination to a mafia don by the name of Johnny Roselle. So it was 2 godfathers, Marcello Trafficante and this mafia don acting for the Chicago mob, Johnny Roselle. And they all later confessed. And so they're the ones who had to kill JFK. Carlos Marcello, he was on trial for most of the month of November. He was not a citizen. He was going to get deported again or sent to prison. So these guys had their backs against the wall. They could no longer go to Cuba. And so that's why they had to kill JFK, or they were finished. In fact, in the weeks before JFK was killed finally in Dallas, which was not their first attempt, the newspapers were full how Bobby was getting ready to send an organized crime strike force into Las Vegas. So the mob no longer had their casinos in Cuba. They couldn't run back to there. And so once they got run out of Las Vegas, there was no place left to go for those godfathers in particular. So they simply had to kill JFK. It was simply for them a matter of survival.
So how did they kill Kennedy? Or please describe for I know the answer to that. How did they kill Kennedy in a way that would cause the government of the United States to cover it up?
Well, and among those people covering up were the president's own brother, Robert Kennedy, because as you and I were the first people to discover and document, and we talked to, people who actually worked on this program. One of the people you talked to is still a confidential source, but the others we can talk about now, who actually worked on this closely with Robert Kennedy. The Kennedys were planning to bring democracy to Cuba. This was a year after that tense nuclear standoff at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, we'd all thought we were going to get blown up. So the Kennedys knew that couldn't be allowed to continue, that kind of tense standoff. This was the height of the Cold War with Russia and the Soviets and the Iron Curtain. It's a very different world than it was today. And so this was a very tense time when we almost had faced nuclear annihilation. The '64 election was coming up as Bobby Kennedy's closest aide, John Edward Nolan, told me personally, Bobby and JFK did not want Cuba to be a political football, just like we see, with different things today in the '64 election. So they had to resolve Cuba before the '64 campaign started off, great guns in January of '64. So the plan was on December the 1st, 1963, 10 days after JFK got back from Dallas, the head of the Cuban army, the number 3 man in Cuba, the guy much more powerful than Che Guevara, who was not even a Cuban, was going to eliminate Fidel and Raul Castro, stage a coup, but he would not take the blame. The head of the Cuban army, Commander Juan Almeida, the highest black official in Cuba, by the way. And this head of the Cuban army, the founder of the Cuban army, this hero of the revolution, was going to blame the deaths of Fidel and Raul Castro on a Russian or a Russian sympathizer, because there were, I believe, 12,000 Russian technical advisors still in Cuba. There were no missiles. There were plenty of Russians to blame it on. Commander Almeida, as head of the army, knew where every one of those Russians was stationed. The CIA, as a kind of backup plan, looks like they were trying to get some U.S. intelligence assets on the ground in Cuba. We no longer had an embassy, which is where the CIA usually stages these things. And so there were U.S. assets that had sympathetic Russian backgrounds who were trying to get into Cuba, because you needed that to be able to just go around Cuba anyway, to appear like you were a Russian sympathizer. And so what the two godfathers were able to do, with the help of Johnny Roselli, they had all 3 of those mobsters, the 2 godfathers and Roselli, they had been hired by the CIA on the orders of Vice President Richard Nixon way back in 1960 for Nixon's campaign against JFK to assassinate Fidel before the '60 election. That had not happened, but those 3 mob leaders were continuing to work for the CIA. The CIA thought they were still trying to help kill Fidel Castro, but of course, he wasn't their concern anymore as long as they had JFK on their back. So the actions those mafia leaders were taking were not to kill Fidel Castro in the fall of 1963. It was to kill John F. Kennedy. So,
right, and in 1960, when Richard Nixon hired these guys, he was vice president of the United States, and Eisenhower had put him in charge of the Cuba desk, as it were, in part to keep him out of the way. Does that recall?
Well, that was he had to throw some sort of a bone to Richard Nixon, and the whole Fidel Castro thing was just kind of a mess. So Eisenhower, when Castro came to town, Eisenhower back in '59. After he had taken over, Eisenhower left town and told Dick Nixon, look, you handle this. Nixon had traveled the world, and gone to Russia, met with Khrushchev. So Nixon saw himself as a foreign affairs expert, so that fit. But the problem was the new president, JFK, after he beat Nixon, was never told about this mafia plot or that it was continuing. When he finally did find out about it in the spring of '62, the CIA said, oh yeah, we finished that. No, they kept on doing it.
So, Lamar, you want to finish your thought there?
Sure. So basically, the two godfathers were able to infiltrate this top secret coup plan that was never supposed to be revealed, not even after Commander Almeida became the leader of Cuba and formed a coalition government with 5 hand-picked leaders, one of whom, actually 2 of whom you and I spoke with. It was never supposed to be known that Commander Almeida had killed Fidel. But into this top secret program that could never be revealed, the Kennedys had banned the mafia, and banned the mafia from reopening their casinos after Castro was overthrown. But the mob bosses had people who were CIA agents, like Bernard Barker, for instance, the later Watergate burglar, had been a longtime operative for Trafficante. He was the top aide. He was a full-time CIA agent who was the aide to the CIA officer who was heading the CIA's part of this plan, a guy by the name of E. Howard Hunt, also a later Watergate burglar. So whether Hunt or not was involved with the assassination or not, that remains a question. But Bernard Barker, as you and I were both told by one of Bobby Kennedy's close associates, Bernard Barker was definitely involved in the assassination, and others were too.
And Barker was working for Trafficante.
Exactly. They were selling out the United States and the Kennedys and the CIA to work for the Godfathers. So they were able to do this. Now, Bobby knew that Bobby worried that Castro might find out and retaliate by maybe assassinating U.S. ambassador. So 2 months before the assassination, Bobby had a subcommittee of the National Security Council start what were called the Cuba contingency plans, how to keep a lid on the top secret JFK Almeida coup plan if it looked like it might leak, or if a foreign ambassador were killed. We didn't want the U.S. to retaliate, only to find out that it had been like a common street robbery, and we've launched World War III thinking Castro found out and killed the U.S. ambassador. So they made all these plans. People like Alexander Haig, Joseph Califano, the Justice Department, all these people made these plans, which wound up being applied to JFK's murder in terms of things like the autopsy, where, if it looked like the U.S. ambassador had been killed by possible Cuban agents in Panama, you'd want the autopsy not in a Panamanian hospital, but in an official U.S. military facility with U.S. military doctors. So in those ways, as Bobby's own closest aide, John Nolan, told me, those plans were actually applied at the autopsy and in many other ways to the JFK assassination to keep a lid on things, to keep from starting World War III. And that was very important because JFK had almost been killed in Chicago. He canceled his trip 3 weeks before Dallas. He came very close to being killed in Tampa, Florida, 4 days before Dallas. They knew about a threat. They knew at least 2 gunmen were at large, but JFK had to give a speech that night with special lines written for Commander Almeida, like buried in the speech, giving him his personal assurance. JFK could not very well cancel that speech, so he went ahead with that motorcade. Trafficante's man on the staff of police force's top man, who headed the police intelligence unit, told him, yeah, hey, the cops know. So that was called off. So everything was kept secret. The Warren Commission was designed to prevent World War III.
Essentially, the reason why the federal government covered up the assassination of John Kennedy at the time was because they thought that there was some Castro involvement with it. They were afraid if word of that got out, that the American people would rise up and demand that we attack Cuba. Kennedy was concerned, or Lyndon Johnson was concerned, if we attacked Cuba, that would trigger the Russians. That would be World War III. We'd all die. And so they had to cover it up because they didn't realize that it was actually the mob. It wasn't Castro. Is that a good summary, Lamar?
That is a wonderful summary. And the other important thing there, too, is Commander Almeida wound up not being exposed.
Right. No, it's...
Che Guevara was put under house arrest. Apparently, somebody said something somewhere way on a low level. And so Che Guevara was put under house arrest, and as we know, eventually exiled to Africa and then to South America to his death. But Commander Almeida remained the number 3 man. So Bobby Kennedy initially tried to get Lyndon Johnson to continue this plan, since Almeida was in place and unexposed. But as Lyndon Johnson told people that you and I talked with, he didn't want to have a bay of pigs in the first few months of his administration.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've only got about 3 minutes here before we hit another break, and I want to get through all this part two stuff. Let's jump ahead to 75, 76, and Bill Barr. Tell me about this.
Watergate
is over.
In 1975, we've gone through Watergate. Bernard Barker and E. Howard Hunt, Watergate burglars, they've been prosecuted. By the way, Watergate was all about trying to hide Nixon's authorization of those CIA mafia plots back in 1960. And so, of course, he had people who worked on those plots, like Hunt and Barker, and most of the others were part of that. And so Nixon has resigned. You know, he was almost impeached. He resigned. Gerald Ford, Nixon's second vice president, first, was Agnew, who resigned in disgrace. Ford is vice president, but word about the CIA mafia plots starts to leak out in 1975. And so Senator Frank Church forms a committee. There's another committee in the House, the Pike Committee, to look into these CIA mafia plots. At that time, there are whispers of a connection to JFK's assassination, but oddly enough, no connection to Watergate, even though most of the Watergate burglars and their leader Hunt had been part of those CIA mafia plots to kill Fidel since they started in 1960. So this is big stuff. Now, Gerald Ford, the vice president, had been part of the Warren Commission. And the Warren Commission had a lot of material withheld from it, but it would look very bad if it made Gerald Ford look like a fool, if all this CIA mafia plot kill Castro stuff somehow revealed stuff that some of those people, or even CIA people like Barker, were involved with the JFK assassination. So that was a big problem for Gerald Ford. So his CIA directors, his second one being a guy by the name of George Bush, the former head of the Republican National Committee, they wanted to just cover up as much as possible because they didn't know the whole story. Ford didn't know the whole story. So much had been kept from the
This is Bush the senior, and he was running the CIA, and his right-hand man was Bill Barr, wasn't he?
Well, Bill Barr started out in the CIA simply because Bush Sr. had been an ambassador to China, I believe, and Barr's specialty—
he was a trade representative, yeah.
A lawyer, right, was China. So, so Barr goes, so now the former trade representative to China is head of the CIA. Barr, goes to the CIA to work. But then starting in 1976, that's in 76, while the Church Committee is going on, then Barr becomes one of the general counsels for the CIA. The job of the general counsels of the CIA, and there were only a few, were to liaison with Congress, with the Senate, investigations, and to provide them information. Well, instead of the CIA providing all this relevant, highly important information to the Church Committee and the House Committee of the Pike Commission, Pike Committee at that time, the CIA is just covering up everything they can because they had already started covering up, with the help of the FBI, by the way, back during the Watergate Committee. Watergate Committee knew nothing about the CIA mafia plots. Really, they had one secret interview some staff members did with Roselli, then that got shut down. And so the CIA
got murdered.
For the Church Committee, for the Watergate Committee. Now they're covering it for the Church Committee. William Barr is right in the middle of all this material, important material they're withholding from Congress.